The current unilateral sanctions imposed by the U.S. on Iran is collective punishment on the Iranian people. It violates not only the Iran nuclear agreement that the U.S. had signed and then unilaterally withdrew from, but it also violates international law, human rights, and of course, U.S. law as well. We will examine the impact of the U.S. economic sanctions on Iran next on the Real News Network. Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Pires coming to you from Baltimore. Here is Idris Jazari, Special Rapporteur on the negative impact of the unilateral coercive measures at the United Nations appointed by the UN Human Rights Council.
These unilateral sanctions have spread like wildfire. The idea was basically, in the context of the Charter, that such sanctions should be determined by the Security Council. But because it was sometimes difficult to achieve consensus on sanctions in the Security Council, there was this practice of unilateral coercive measures was resorted to by a large number of mainly industrialized countries. So it became, you could say today, about a quarter of the world's population lives in countries that are the target of sanctions, unilateral sanctions.
To dig into this further with me, I'm joined by Mark Weisbrot. Mark is co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research and the author of the book Failed: What Experts Got Wrong About the Global Economy. Good to have you here, Mark.
Thanks, Sharmini.
All right, Mark, explain how these unilateral sanctions imposed on Iran and the impact that is having on Iran for a long time now.
Well, the first impact that they have, and you can see it very obviously, is the impact on oil production. From January 2012, when the sanctions were imposed, you saw a drop of 832,000 barrels a day, which is a huge amount of oil production just from January to October. And that year, GDP fell by 7.7%, which is a huge drop, a deep recession. So that's what happened there. And then you can also see the impact when the sanctions were lifted, or most of the sanctions were lifted, not all of them, and you see a rebound of 12% growth in GDP in 2016, which is enormous, and 972,000 barrels a day in oil production. And then what happens when Trump in May of 2018 announced that he's going to reinstitute sanctions, economic sanctions. And of course, you can see in the graph when it actually happens in November, but again, there was a lot of drop in anticipation. But once again, you get a big drop in oil production, and you had inflation of 51% in 2018. Since the sanctions have been implemented, the currency is down about more than 50% on the parallel market. That contributes a lot to the inflation. And for 2019, the IMF has lowered their projection for economic growth for Iran from -3% to -6% as a result of the sanctions, and it can get a lot worse. And so this is, and people are punished by this. This is an attack on the civilian population and their loss of income, and also their loss of access to medicines. So, for example, and there's more studies of this than there are on the sanctions against Venezuela. But there was a 2016 study done by faculty at the University of California, San Diego School of Medicine, and they found 73 drugs that were related to the specific disease burden of Iran, and there were shortages, and 44% of these were essential medicines, according to the World Health Organization. So this is very serious impact. Sanctions really are, these economic sanctions are really a form of warfare, and they kill people just like bombing does and other forms of conventional warfare.
Mark, it is obviously a form of economic warfare, as you say. What course of action can Iran take in order to overcome these kinds of internationally illegal, unilateral economic warfare to have intended to have collective punishment?
Well, I think one way that they can survive and is to get countries like other countries to not go along with the U.S. sanctions, because the United States, one of the great powers that the U.S. government, the Trump administration uses, is to be able to threaten financial institutions who don't do what they want with sanctions against them. And that's why you see the shortages of pharmaceuticals, for example, because the pharmaceutical companies and the banks that finance credit don't want to run afoul of what the U.S. wants, because they will be slapped with sanctions as well. So the more that other countries decide they don't want to do this, and China is a big one right now. It looks like China is buying oil from Iran, even though the United States told them not to do that. So I think that's how this kind of illegal these illegal coercive measures like sanctions are going to be reduced or hopefully eventually eliminated.
Mark, the UN Special Rapporteur really calls out the United States on this and says that the only way forward, according to international law and the United Nations Charter, is diplomacy. Your thoughts on that?
Yes, that's absolutely right. And this is the other really ugly part of these economic sanctions. It's a form of warfare, and it's, of course, a substitute for diplomacy and respect for international law and norms. And it's violence, and it's violence being used instead of negotiation. And that's what makes it even more of a threat, because this is what wars are made of as well, conventional wars.
All right, Mark, I thank you, as always, for joining us here on the Real News Network.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.